Hello and welcome to AS Psychology Revision for Key Approaches. Firstly is the Psychodynamic Approach. There are three levels of the mind: the conscious, the preconscious and the unconscious. The unconscious is not accessible and the preconscious is not immediately accessible, but the conscious is always accessible. There is then the structure of personality, which is split into three. The id is the pleasure principle which you are born with. It is seen as selfish. Ego is the reality principle, which is a balance between the id and the superego. And the superego is the morality principle, which you develop around 3+. This is seen as giving. There is then the hydraulic drives, eros and thanatos. Eros is the life instinct, for example sexual reproduction, and thanatos is the death instinct, for example extreme sports. You then have the 5 psychosexual stages. Fixation in any of these stages causes behaviour in adulthood. There is oral, anal, phallic, latency and genital. This can be remembered as old age pensioners love genitals. Oral occurs from 0 to 18 months and is a fixation on the mouth. Anal occurs from 18 to 36 months and is a fixation on the anus. This could decide whether you are a clean or a tidy person when you're older, depending on how you were toilet trained. And oral could cause habits such as nail biting or smoking. Phallic is fixation on the genitals from 3 to 6 years and is when the Oedipus and Electra complex occurs. Latency is 6+ when there is little contact between men and women, and genital is puberty onwards. There are also the defense mechanisms, which are strategies to reduce conflict in the ego and anxiety. These are repression, displacement, projection, denial, and regression. Repression is forgetting bad memories. Displacement is transferring feelings from one thing to a less threatening object. For example, you're mad at your friend, so you kick the door. Projection is placing undesired thoughts on others. Denial is refusing to accept reality. For example, refusing to accept someone is dead or a breakup. And regression is going back to childlike behaviour. Pros and cons. It recognises the importance of childhood experiences which can be used to predict adult behaviour. It has been successful in developing treatments which has led to other therapies, which is an aim of psychology because it's useful. It uses the case study research method, which isn't representative, so it can't be generalised. It's also unscientific as it focuses on unconscious mind, which can't be tested, so it's not useful. It focuses on past events and ignores social factors and biological factors, so it's a reductionist approach. It ignores factors that could better explain behaviour. Next we have the Behaviorist Approach. They only test observable, objective and measurable behaviour, OOM. So it's scientific and it uses lab experiments. It's also a nurture approach because all behaviour is assumed to be learned from the environment. This means it ignores biological influences or free will. All behaviour is believed to be caused by responding automatically to a stimulus, such as food, being the stimulus, producing saliva, being the response. Another assumption is classical conditioning, which is learning by association. So, associating the primary stimulus with a secondary stimulus as it occurs at the same time, the same response is reproduced. For example, Sophie goes to the hospital to get treatment, which always makes her feel sick. So whenever she goes to the hospital, she feels sick, regardless of whether she's receiving treatment or not. There is also operant conditioning, which is learning by reinforcement. This is when behaviour is learned through operating on the environment. If the consequences produce a positive reward, for example, pulling a lever reveals chocolate, it reinforces behaviour, so it's more likely to be repeated, because everyone likes chocolate, right? As it strengthens learned behaviour. Pros and cons. It uses lab experiments, which is highly controlled, so it's scientific, and objective, which means it can give us cause and effect. It also has practical applications for removing unwanted behaviours such as phobias through aversion therapy, so it's been successful. However, lab experiments lack ecological validity, so you can't generalise them to real life. It also ignores free will. Humans can make a decision on whether to respond to some behaviour or not, so it's a reductionist approach and doesn't give us a full understanding of behaviour. It can't explain new and creative behaviours, so it's not a full explanation of behaviour. So another approach may be more useful, for example biological. It uses the comparative method, which assumes there's no difference between humans and animals, but humans are more complex and have free will, so results can't be generalised because it's too simplistic. Then we have the social learning theory, which assumes behaviour is learned from models that are appropriate and that you identify with. Behaviour is learned through observation, imitation, and reinforcement. It is learnt under 4 conditions: attention, retention, motor reproduction, and motivation. Attention is watching what the model does. Retention is remembering the model's actions. Motor reproduction is actively imitating it. And motivation is wanting to be like the model and wanting to copy the behaviour. There are mediating cognitive factors, which are thought processes between the SR, stimulus-response, link, which influence behaviour. Social learning theory also assumes vicarious reinforcement. This is where behaviour is learned from observing consequences of actions from another person, who must be a role model. For example, if someone does something bad like steal and they get punished for it, then you are likely not to steal. One study, the Bobo doll study, aimed to see if behaviour was influenced by reinforcement. The method they used was using subjects aged 4 to 5 and making them observe models being aggressive to Bobo dolls. The models were negatively, positively, or not reinforced at all. They found that behaviour was copied depending on the type of reinforcement, and girls were more affected by negative reinforcement than boys. Pros and cons of the social learning theory. It accounts for cognitive processes, so it's less mechanistic than behaviourist. This means it gives us a better explanation for why people respond to stimulus. It uses lab experiments to study behaviour, which is scientific, so we can have cause and effect. It explains behaviour such as aggression, and it has practical applications, so it's been useful and successful. However, it ignores biological factors that may influence behaviour, so it might not quite give a full understanding of behaviour. It also can't explain how people behave in new ways that haven't been observed, so it doesn't give a full explanation. So another approach, such as the biological approach, may give a better explanation. After this, we have the cognitive approach. This approach assumes that humans are information processors, so they process information like a computer. For example, the input into the computer could be a stimulus. The processing of the computer would be the organism processing what response to use, and the output would be the response. Cognitive theory uses models to explain behaviour and thought, for example the computer analogy mentioned above. It also assumes, like the social learning theory, that the organism contains mediators, which are thought processes, which produce the response. It also assumes that the capacity of the organism is limited. People can only remember and perform a limited number of tasks at one time. For example, they can only remember up to 7 numbers at one time. Another assumption is that we have schemas, which is where a person's knowledge and beliefs influence behaviour. This affects our interpretation of things. For example, we wouldn't touch a hot pan because after burning yourself once, you'd remember not to do that again without protection. Pros and cons of the cognitive approach. It scientifically investigates the mind using lab experiments, so cause and effect can be established. It has practical applications for anxiety disorders and eyewitness testimony, so it's been useful and successful. The behaviorist and social learning theory only study observable behaviour, but cognitive studies human mental processes as well, which gives us a greater understanding of how things like memory works. Its use of models helps psychologists understand mental processes, so it's useful. However, lab experiments lack ecological validity as it's an artificial environment, so it can't be generalised. And the comparison to computers is controversial because it's seen as too simplistic. Humans are illogical and emotional. Computers are not, so perhaps it's inaccurate. Then we have the humanistic approach. This assumes that all humans are unique individuals with free will. This means we are responsible for our own actions and behaviour. We all have a self-concept and an ideal self. And if there is too much incongruence, conflict, between them, this causes mental health problems. Incongruence is caused by conditions of worth being placed upon you as a child. This is where you felt like you had to stick to conditions to be valued. It assumes that behaviour is motivated by Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is where needs must be satisfied to achieve self-actualization. It is motivated by deficiency or growth. Basic needs must be fulfilled, for example food and water, or interest in high levels of hierarchy diminishes. If needs in the bottom level of the hierarchy are unsatisfied, the interest in higher levels disappear, which leads to psychological illness. Some pros and cons of this approach. It recognises people are responsible for their own behaviour, so it acknowledges free will. This explains an area of psychology that other approaches have rejected. It has also introduced client-centered therapy to reduce incongruence, so it's had practical applications and it has been effective for some disorders, such as depression. So it's been helpful and successful. However, people need to be able to articulate for therapy to work. Not many people can actually articulate, so it's not useful to some. It also rejects scientific investigation. It lacks empirical evidence and support, so it's less likely to be used. So another approach, such as the biological approach, might be better. And very few people actually self-actualize. It's not very realistic, so it's not very useful. Last but not least, we have the biological approach. This assumes that all behaviour is explained by our genetic structures, so it's a nature theory. So the genotype influences behaviour, and the genotype is the genetic makeup of a human that's determined by biological hereditary factors, for example your eye colour. It also assumes that biological structures such as the brain and the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system explain behaviour and your brain chemistry. So physical structures only, not the environment. It also assumes your inheritance is important. How your genetic makeup, your genotype, influences behaviour and physical appearance, your phenotype. Evolution of behaviour. So changes in behaviour to adapt to the environment. If it helps it survive, it's more likely to reproduce and pass changes on to the offspring. For example, developing aggressiveness. It also uses the comparative method, as animals are biologically the same as humans, so they are used to investigate behaviour because they share the same basic structures. So they're generalised to human behaviour. Pros and cons of the biological approach. Its method of investigation, lab experiments, is observable, objective and measurable, so it's scientific and can give us cause and effect. It has many practical applications such as drug treatments for mental illnesses like depression and has been successful, so it's useful. However, it ignores conscious thought, doesn't look at all possible aspects of behaviour, so it's not a full understanding. It also compares humans to animals. Humans are more complex and animals are too simplistic, so you can't generalise the results. It's also a reductionist approach as it explains all behaviour through physical processes and ignores other factors like social and environmental, so it's not a full understanding. So another approach could explain this better, for example the cognitive approach.